Welcome back to final panel of today's forum on climate transitions finance, the key to net zero. Without further ado, let me introduce the panel moderator, our very own Jonathan Ju, Vice President of Hong Kong Green Finance Association, Managing Director, ESG Solutions, Global Banking, HSBC. Some told me they call him the godfather of green finance, given the number of decades he has been driving the ESG agenda. So over to you, Jonathan, please. Ashley.
Tracy, thank you very much. But I think I should say thank you for that introduction, and welcome everybody to the last panel. I'm joined here on this very important last panel by Ian Alder, the CEO at the Securities and Futures Commission here in Hong Kong. But also we have 4 other esteemed panelists online, who I'm going to introduce one by one as we get going. As Tracy introduced, our topic for this session is where are we with climate transition finance? i.e., do we have the money to finance a transition to low carbon? And the objective in this session is to bring very much an international perspective to this discussion. The focus is on climate. Of course, there is a much broader set of sustainability issues, but in this session we are going to focus on specifically the climate challenge, given the scale of that challenge, the urgency and the threat that it represents. Now, to get us warmed up for the conversation, we have a question, a warm-up question, which should be coming on your screens now, or coming onto your screens. And the question is as follows: what is the most important action that a smart financial institution should be taking in the next 12 months to maximize returns in a world that is transitioning to low carbon? And there are 4 or 5 answers suggested for you there. The question is asking which is the most important, so you don't have the option to say all of the above. Please think about which is the most important. Clearly, you're being invited to put yourself into the shoes of a financial institution and what a financial institution might be doing. The objective here is maximizing returns in this question. So we're being very straightforward about the objective, but maximizing the returns in a sort of an optimistic outlook that we will as a society be transitioning. So what might we be doing? And we can see a good number of answers coming in. I'll perhaps give people perhaps just 30 seconds more to select one of those answers. And while you're doing that, I'll point out that we have the something else answer at the bottom. If you do think there's something else, please do answer. And that's also perhaps a reminder to think about using the Q&A box. If you think it's something else, please do share through the Q&A box if you have other ideas that you'd like to bring forward and have discussed by the panel. And of course, use the Q&A as well if you have questions for the panelists, and I shall do my best to try and incorporate those into the conversation. Well, there we go. I think in 3, 2, 1, perhaps we'll close the poll with an extraordinary result. Maybe there's something about narrow run polls these days, because we have A and B seem to be in the lead here. A lot of people looking for scenario analysis, and a lot of people think that having some definitions to help guide investment will be a useful thing. Well, look, thank you for that participation. And perhaps without further ado, let's get into the conversation. And given so many have picked answer A and thought about scenario analysis, for us bankers, that makes us think of certainly what our prudential regulators are asking us to do at the moment. And with that, I'd like to introduce Morgan Després from the Banque de France. Morgan's role at the Banque de France is as the Deputy Head of Financial Stability, but he also is head of the NGFS Secretariat. Morgan, if I might, sort of over to you, perhaps just a little introduction for our participants around the NGFS, and also perhaps help us think about why scenario analysis is so key to what prudential regulators are thinking that the banks you regulate should be looking at. Morgan, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you all. First of all, let me tell you how happy I am to be here today with some friends in this panel. And it's also very comforting to see everyone here in Hong Kong just sitting down without wearing masks. It gives us a little bit of hope here in Europe. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. So thank you. So maybe a few words to introduce who we are at the NGFS. So the NGFS is the network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system. And we are a bit of a strange animal, actually. We are a network, a coalition of central banks and supervisors, but we don't have any legal existence. We are actually a club, a team of central banks, which decided at some point in time at the end of 2017 to pool their resources and efforts to better understand what was going on the front of climate risk and what they could do, because we really had the feeling at that time that other fora like G20 or G7, FSB were probably not enough, and that we had to enter into a more technical discussions between peers to better understand how to measure risks, how to mitigate it. And so we saw that we were 8, including I saw my good friend Marjun. And now we are more than 75 members. So clearly the momentum grew enormously. And what was initially a very small club is now a much bigger coalition. So just to try to say a few words about the importance of scenario analysis. I guess everybody here is aware of the specificities of climate risks. It has a number of peculiarities which make it difficult for supervisors and central banks to measure it properly. First, because it's something that is a medium and long-term time horizon, a time horizon that is much longer than the one we use usually in our supervisory efforts. We're not talking about RWAs, which are calculated over a 1-year forward-looking time horizon, but we need to take a much longer time horizon, like 5, 10, 15 years time, which is not what we do usually. This is not what we do neither in our model, econometric models. So the time horizon is different. It's a risk that is non-linear. You have a lot of non-linearities and tipping points in there. So it's quite difficult to capture it, to forecast it. And also it's a risk that brings together financial but also non-financial metrics. And it's quite difficult to make sense of out of those data. You need to tell a story. You need to tell a narrative. In other words, you need to tell a scenario. And this is precisely what the NGFS has tried to do. And you may remember we issued in June this year 3 reference scenarios, which are actually some proposals, some possible pathways towards a low carbon transition. And in those scenarios that we designed and produced together with a consortium of scientists, bringing together people from the IPCC and other hard sciences, what we're basically putting on the table is 3 possible pathways which bring together physical risks, but also transition risks on a longer time horizon, trying also to factor in potential regulatory decisions, consumer behaviors, potentially technical innovation. And the idea is to say, look, we don't know, we cannot forecast what's going to happen, we don't know. But we believe that the transition may follow either an orderly path, either a late path, or either an early reaction path, which would go down having a more regular steep of the curve at the end of the period. So we try to put everything together. And what we basically say is that, look, this is a proposal. We think it may be useful for everyone to have those reference scenarios. It's definitely not the end of the conversation. It's mostly, as we see at the beginning of the conversation. We hope to update those scenarios going forward to make them more granular, to bringing more geographic diversity. But the objective is really to help the industry working on this, because clearly one of the feedback we got from bankers is that they were pretty much expecting from us some guidance and a harmonized way to carry out those scenario analysis. And this is what we are trying to do. Of course, it's not perfect. It's not the end of the conversation, but we hope it's going to help the industry harmonizing its risk measurement practices. Jonathan, with that, I think I'm done with the first round of.
That's perfect, Morgan. Look, thank you very much. So clearly, the prudential regulator, central banks, looking at banks and saying you might need a new way of approaching risk as we look at this very long transition period. Perhaps sort of to build on that and staying with the sort of the theme of regulatory action or the setting of regulatory expectations. I'd like to bring Ashley Alder, who's sitting here with me in HSBC studios here, to perhaps talk a little bit about, and we heard, for those of you who've been with the our forum through the day, you'll have heard an excellent summary of the broad map of sustainable finance activities from Ashley just after lunchtime. But perhaps building on that and building on what Morgan has said, Ashley, just to talk a little bit about in other areas what financial institutions might expect in terms of the continuing evolution around regulatory expectations.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's the right question to ask me because I am a regulator, so I only look at this topic through that lens. I guess the one question that is posed to market regulators, as distinct, and I say market regulators as distinct from central banks and prudential regulators, who are essentially looking at balance sheet risk within insurers, banks, etc. So from our perspective, we're looking at the whole range of regulation in relation to climate finance as it applies to corporates, to asset managers, to products, basically. But the question that is posed to us is normally something like this. Can you make Tcfd mandatory? Now, it's a very easy question to ask. It's quite a difficult one to answer. And the key to this, I think, is that all of the information that can be used by those in the investment chain, from asset manager to asset owner, etc., crucially depends on the information that is being disclosed at a corporate or a real economy level. And I think I probably mentioned this, if I remember, on the speech I did earlier on. So, and so the question is posed really, can you make climate disclosure mandatory at a corporate level? Now, once you start unpacking that, there are two main impediments, the first of which has already been touched on, which is that if you're going to back mandatory with enforcement powers, because the two tend to go together in our world, then it's quite difficult to apply enforcement to failures to disclose what-if scenario analysis, basically. So you have to take a different approach. There's no doubt about that in my mind now, particularly as the question of should it be mandatory has been posed now for at least 5 years, ever since Tcfd started its work, which I think was around 2015.
And the Reserve Bank in New Zealand, I believe, has now made it or indicated it will make it mandatory.
But then the question is, to us, it's fine to say it's mandatory. What does that actually mean once you unpack the word mandatory in the context of our job as a regulator? So it's very, very difficult to, I think, to look at this through the sort of conventional lens of normal corporate disclosure, which is usually around historic events, effectively, financial statements, etc. Something around future, I mean, obviously financial statements contain elements of what might happen in the future, but it's very short term. It's certainly not long term as scenario analysis is set out to be. So that's the first dilemma. Second dilemma for us is that although on the whole, regulators like us, we're a securities market regulator, capital market regulator, we, on the whole, directly regulate those firms that are licensed with us, which are asset managers, amongst others. We do not directly regulate, in that sense, the corporate world, listed companies. There are listing rules, of course, which are, what can I call them, soft law. In fact, they're not law, they're soft, basically. Yeah. They're certainly not the sort of hard law that we apply to our registrants. So that's the other dilemma here. What's the regulatory nexus which allows us to impose mandatory in the context of corporate level disclosure? And I think I did mention this earlier on. I think, nevertheless, there is coming into view a potential answer to this, which is a combination of GRI, SASB and such like, now saying that they're going to converge or work on convergence of their standards, because one of the long-standing issues has been the multiplicity of standards leading to the inability of investors to compare, basically. Yeah. So they're doing that. Second thing is the, I think, very interesting IFRS consultation. And the reason I think that's interesting is because if IFRS are serious about setting up a parallel board for sustainable finance, starting with climate, in order to effectively subsume the standards that have been converged by the standard setters, you then have something which is far closer to the core of detailed disclosure which corporates are expected to produce in any event in relation to conventional financial statements. Now, clearly, the type of disclosure will be different, there's no doubt about that, but it's closer to that. And on top of that, you will get potentially a governance framework, a single governance framework, which is parallel to IFRS. IOSCO, which is a sort of global club of regulators that I chair, had a lot to do with the establishment of IFRS about 15 years ago. So you can see a parallel there. And then also you would get, so you get convergence, you get governance, and potentially you get assurance. Because that's what investors look for, you know, effectively the equivalent of audit in the context of disclosures around climate within that framework. Now, it's all very, very new, but I do think there is the kernel of a potential solution to the dilemma that I mentioned.
Actually, that's incredibly helpful, and it's just helped me connect some of the things you were talking about in your earlier commentary that are around the relevance and importance of sustainability reporting standards, because if we can get them to the same level and same quality as accounting standards, then generally under corporate law it's a legal obligation to report in accordance with accounting standards, and therefore that would be critical then in creating that data availability, which would then allow the organisations that you regulate to actually do much more than perhaps they can today. So thank you for that, and also thank you for reminding us around just sort of how we need to, I suppose, sort of remember the boundaries of responsibility that are allocated to certain parties, including regulators, which in a sense by inverse leaves the requirement and the opportunity for others, whether it's other public sector via policy or private sector via general market development, also to have a crucial role. And that's why I'd like to bring in our next panelist, a gentleman that I think will be known to many of you, Mr. Sean Kidney from his room in London. Sean, thank you very much for joining us. A small anecdote, I met Sean for the first time about 5 years ago when the green bond market was, I think, order of magnitude about a $20 billion market per annum. And I remember Sean, in one of those early conversations, he said, we've got to turn this into a $1 trillion market. Now, it struck me in the previous panel when people were saying we need trillions, not billions, that actually from that $20 billion market, the first week of October, you might have been otherwise preoccupied, Sean, but you probably know there was $20 billion of sustainable bonds issued in the first week of October. multiply that by 50-something weeks, and there's our $1 trillion market. Now, obviously, we don't have every week at that level, but maybe this year, with a fair following wind through the last few months, we might get to $500 billion. So, but anyway, that's my piece of doing your marketing for you, Sean. And the reason I'm doing that is because the question I want to ask you is a bit different on your other key area of focus, which is the very important work you've been doing on taxonomies and definitions and how those provide crucial input into directing capital. And I think it was our second most popular, or in fact, one of the top two answers from the group in terms of the importance of those. So perhaps you can just tell us perhaps where we are, and are we making good progress to having what we might call a sort of a globally usable and relevant set of definitions to guide investment?
Thank you so much, Jonathan. You're right. We hit $1 trillion outstanding in the green bond market recently, so not $1 trillion a year, but we're getting there. But we have a long way to go. As you all know, our climate clock is ticking. And while we have made great progress in growing green finance, we are still a long, long way from where we need to be to ensure some kind of sustainable future for our children. So we've got to always bear that in mind. In Europe, we've been working on trying to make it easy for the market to know what's the right thing to do in the context of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And that's what the EU taxonomy essentially is. I mean, of course, we have a precedent. The Chinese green produce catalogue is the precedent. That helped fuel, in fact, was a critical factor in fueling the Chinese green bond market, now the world's largest. We have seen recently the daughters of green bonds, the use of proceeds bonds in social, sustainable, COVID arising out of China early this year, and so on. All of those are now crying out for definitions. In the work we've done in Europe, we're marrying the guidelines, the model that the PBOC has used in Green Projects Catalogue, with disclosure regulation. So all investors, corporations, and banks will need, well, subject to the EBA ruling regulation coming through, will be required to report on their high carbon and sustainable investments going forward in Europe to a common language. Folks, we finally have a common language for the E and ESG after all these years of what can only be called fragmentation, which of course is no way to grow a market, as Morgan would know. So we now have the beginnings of a major change. We've specifically said in that taxonomy work that transitions is a key part of what we need to do. Now, why transitions? Well, clearly, in many areas, we're going to have a moving goalpost as we shift the steel industry to becoming zero carbon. I'm predicting 2035, by the way, but here we go. We've got to have a moving goalpost about what will qualify in this market to try and push that industry in property, in concrete, etc. And this is getting very urgent. You'll be aware that we've had some extraordinary government commitments in recent months, starting off with the European 2050 and now the European 2030 commitment to 55% reductions by 2030 in a speech by Ursula von der Leyen. China's fantastic commitment to 2060 carbon neutrality, and frankly, it will do better than that, but hey. And then Japan, in the maiden speech to the Parliament, Prime Minister Suga announced that Japan will shift to 2050 net zero commitment, as Korea has as well. And big news of today, of course, is that in the Biden administration platform, they're planning to do the same thing too. And if you have any doubts that Biden is going to be the president, you're reading the wrong data. So we can now look forward to a situation where from the end of January, all the world's major economies have basically the same targets.
Yeah.
Wow, we have to figure out what to do because frankly, the current trajectory of our economy isn't right. That becomes the transitions work. So in Europe, the work we're doing now on transitions, and we published a major paper about this at Climate Bonds recently, is about how to flesh out what that would look like, how to turn it from the use of proceeds to an entity-based assessment framework. We've established 5 very simple principles. If you're transitioning, you've got to know what you're transitioning to. And as Zoe will know, that is the Paris Agreement. So everything needs to work backwards from the Paris Agreement. 1. 2, it has to be science-based. Get rid of the opinion, please. Science-based. Offsets don't count. We're looking at the asset or the entity. We're not looking about whether you plant some forests in California or in Peru. We are looking for the technology solution, not whether we can do it and whether we should soften the edges because of competitiveness issues. It's too late for that. We have not listened to our scientists for the last 30 years. We need to listen to our scientists. And finally, and most importantly for our market, action, not pledges. We will not accept promises. We want something actually happen, including contracts. If you're building a carbon capture and sequestration scheme, you can't say in 2035, I'm going to add it on. Guys, I want a contract to prove it's been built, etc. So very clear principles to take this market forward, and that'll become the guide rails for the future. Now, this is really important for the Greater Bay Area because we are starting a major global economic rebalancing. You're in a room there, as Morgan says, hallelujah, this is crazy. Well, I'm in my kitchen and I can't get out of it. The Chinese economy is growing. The European economy is not. Money will shift. That money in Europe and in other countries wants green. If there are green opportunities in the Greater Bay Area, we will maximise capital flows. The Greater Bay Area government officials understand this. This is the opportunity for Hong Kong to become a larger door, an even larger door, if that's possible, to the Chinese economy with the starting off of the Greater Bay Area, not only as money tries to shift. Now, of course, there's work to be done by the regulators. Ma Jun knows that. But the regulators in China have already done an incredible amount of work in the last few years to remove roadblocks. Guys, money will flow. It will be green. It will have to meet the combined Chinese and European taxonomy, which, by the way, we're working on. In fact, with Ma Jun, we're helping the Europeans and the Chinese to harmonise the taxonomies. That will be part of the future. So the opportunity is incredible. The transition part has to be robust. It will be robust. We can't afford, we have no time because that clock is ticking for weak transition. It needs to be robust transition, but by golly, we need transition, and it'll be happening in China.
And if I understand correctly, Sean, June is when you've committed to, with Dr. Ma, of course, to have the alignment around this common language. But of course, remembering, and I might come back to this one, common languages through sort of, or universal global languages through history and mythology have had a bit of a checkered history. So perhaps, but before coming back to that, let's perhaps look at what the transition in some key industrial sectors really will actually mean and what are the relevant technologies. So that perhaps I'd like to bring in here, as you kindly did there, Sean, bring in our next panelist, my colleague Zoe Knight, who heads the HSBC Centre of Sustainable Finance out of London. Zoe is also a commissioner on the Energy Transition Commission. So I would suggest ideally placed to accept Sean's invitation or my invitation to talk a little bit about what will it look like in Asia, this transition in some of those key industries that Sean just touched on there.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I just would like to add to my fellow panelists in citing my delight of joining you today, even though it is from London and the comfort of my living room. But it's really great to see some familiar faces and, as Morgan mentioned, to see you all in person in Hong Kong. But first, there are three things that I'd like to cover this afternoon in Hong Kong. One, a little bit about the urgency to act and why that is still the case in sectors despite the COVID consequences that we're seeing today. Two, a little bit more on the technical solutions, which is how the real economy transformation is actually going to take place and how we are actually going to be able to deliver that pace of change required to meet our Paris goals. And thirdly, a little bit about the investor backdrop globally and what the appetite is for such solutions in transition finance. But first, of course, we all know the consequences from both a humanitarian and economic backdrop in terms of COVID. From a climate perspective, the first half of the year saw a drop in global emissions of some 9%. Now that is massive, but of course nobody wants to see a standstill of the global economy as being the solution to climate change. We just can't possibly have that as our backdrop. So moving forward, exactly how are we going to deliver that full-scale real economy transformation that is needed to enable us to prosper in a zero carbon framework? Well, first, just thinking a little bit about the sectors, we all know that the power sector is a core contributor to emissions. In fact, across Asia, power contributes around 50% of the mix. And indeed, Asia as a whole contributes around 50% of global emissions in their entirety. But power, to some degree, is very straightforward. We know how to decarbonise, and that's very much on track. The cost of providing renewables is falling all of the time. Technology is moving faster. The enabling environment is changing in terms of de-risking. The private projects are coming through that are supporting public goals. And that's very much in track, albeit not as the pace that we would like to see in terms of reducing emissions. The far greater and more interesting problem to look at, particularly within finance, is what industry is going to do. Clearly, our foundations are built around a real estate that is built on steel and cement. Our transport infrastructures are critical to shipping goods around. But there are difficulties in terms of those sectors and what they might do to decarbonise. And the work of the Energy Transition Commission has been very helpful in providing that technical roadmap for those sectors. Now, the technical roadmap is to think about where carbon capture, utilisation and storage and hydrogen fits into this mix. Now, clearly, those two technologies have been something that have been somewhat overlooked in the early days of thinking about green finance, when we, about 10, 15 years ago, all thought that we would be able to solve the emissions equation by simply switching our power capacity needs. Well, we're not moving quickly enough on that front, and so industry is becoming a much more important factor for investors to look at, and is one of the reasons why the transition narrative is becoming that much greater, in particular with thinking about use of proceeds in those industries. So if you think about carbon capture and storage, for example, and the application both within utilities but also within oil and gas and the industrial sectors of steel, we're looking at an investment requirement of around 240 billion per annum out to 2060. No mean feat. But again, with the markets thinking about transition labelling, taxonomy and use of proceeds, it provides a much stronger foundation for investors to understand where carbon capture fits into that overall equation. Similarly, for hydrogen scale-up, we're looking at about 130 billion per annum out to 2050. Again, not small numbers, but again, greatly helped by transparency that taxonomy brings around where hydrogen fits into a Paris-aligned future. So the good news is we know we've got a good idea what to do. We've got work in progress on taxonomy and the financial system to look at these issues. Now, the third piece of good news is that there's investor appetite to look at these sectors. A survey that HSBC has run fairly recently found that 94% of investors and issuers want to factor in environmental, social and governance issues to their investment decision making. So I think I'll stop there, Jonathan. We've got the urgency to act in place, but we know what to do. We've got the taxonomy and drivers within the financial system that are helping guide investors into the right direction for those sectors and frameworks. And we've got the appetite to get it done.
Zoe, brilliant. Thank you very much. And you've focused very much there on the sort of the industrial transition, and it sort of makes me think I'd like to bring in Lisa Genasci, our final panelist at this point, to talk about the opportunity or the potential for natural solutions to getting to net zero and the 2 degrees C target. I know Sean made a comment about you can't just plant a few trees and call yourself net zero, but there does seem to be an important opportunity there. I noticed some reports the other day that put the potential sink for southwest China at something like 0.5 gigaton per annum. Now that's material, I would suggest. So Lisa Genasci is the CEO of ADM Capital Foundation. Lisa has done a huge amount of work on environmental impact investing. Lisa, what, in your view, is the potential contribution of natural carbon sinks? And what is your experience on realizing that potential and sort of investor appetite for that been to date, and how might the outlook for that be?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jonathan, and thanks for having me on this panel. Of course, my perspective as CEO of a foundation is going to be slightly different than everyone else's, but I think when talking about climate, we need to be thinking about partnerships and varied perspectives and how we can all contribute, which is, I guess, a point of what I will say. But from our perspective, and certainly from ADM Capital's perspective, we see responding to our changing climate as not just a moral responsibility, but a huge investable opportunity as we inevitably transition our global economies to net zero emissions. I don't think anyone on this panel would disagree that that's coming at us. This is an opportunity that will also foster new jobs, encourage technological innovation. You mentioned technology, and build resilience in rural communities if we get it right. And transition is, of course, a critical part of this discussion, knowing that there'll be that period of sort of imperfection where we need to support critical industries towards sustainability. And yes, as other panelists have mentioned, we need clear definitions, a clear unified standards, a new financial architecture to guide the process in Asia that builds on the taxonomy work in Europe and China that's sort of ongoing. We need a traceability technology and satellite mapping for monitoring, fintech solutions, digitized data for farmers to move into sort of common use to help scale what needs to happen. And we know that if we act boldly, only if we act boldly, are we going to keep global warming to below 1.5 degrees, which is where we need to be. And of course, then bringing it back to sort of agriculture and forests, this includes making sure our agriculture supply chains are deforestation-free and community-inclusive looking forward. In simplified terms, forests, farms, fields can absorb massive amounts of greenhouse gases, while unhealthy ones emit them. So as a consequence, if we do get this right, estimates are that natural climate solutions could cost-effectively deliver 1/3 of the emissions reductions we need to keep global warming under that 1.5 degrees Celsius target. I noted a recent Nature Conservancy study that shows that between now and 2030, better land stewardship offers actually 37% of the solution for keeping global temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius or below. That is the same, actually, as if the world were to put a complete stop on the burning of oil. So quite obviously monumental. Yet today, these solutions only receive about 3% of dedicated climate investments. And in philanthropic terms, climate support receives only a fraction of the estimated 3% global funds dedicated to environmental protection work. Now, given the urgency that we've all noted today, given the sort of monumental scale of the work that needs to happen, that is quite shocking. Another major problem we face in transitioning agriculture and forestry sectors in Asia, where there are significant carbon sinks. Indonesia is the third largest has the third largest extent of forests globally, is that countries themselves have little incentive to protect these forests. There have been sort of commitments and promises and pledges, but a lot of that funding has not materialized. That Nature Conservancy study that I mentioned shows that variations of land-based climate solutions appear in more than 75% of individual country commitments. Those are the NDCs to the Paris Agreement. Yet renewable energy efficiency, and clean transport receive nearly 30 times the amount of public mitigation investment that land-based solutions receive. And of course, it's not just forests that act as our carbon sinks, but healthy, as I've said, healthy, restored land areas, wetlands and peatlands. These are all critical in terms of the sort of the task at hand. Protecting these are critical in terms of the task at hand. And of course, we've also mentioned restoration brings social and environmental co-benefits, such as cleaner air, water, sustainable food production, and increased habitat. We cannot forget the importance of maintaining biodiversity globally at the same time as we're managing our climate risk. According to the FAO, in Asia and the Pacific, more than half the economically active population is engaged in agriculture, which is obviously a major sector for all of our economies. I think Asia produces 20% of the world's food. So to truly transition agriculture, we need innovative or blended finance to help lead the way with credit enhancements and other support to encourage commercial capital, because still most investors are not seeing the pathway to these sort of new business models. They're seeing risk, not pathways. And this can be justified, of course, given the importance to local economies, people, and our global climate, in terms of access to public funds to support these projects. This, we believe, would encourage private sector climate investments at scale that can generate those positive economic and ecological returns and encourage the business unusual that's so needed in this, really across our sectors, but particularly in agriculture and in the forestry sectors. As I mentioned, there's been sort of a lot of talk about the carbon markets, compensation, international climate finance instruments, but these have not been able so far to drive the sufficient investment to protect our carbon sinks or transition agriculture at scale to a production and protection model, which is sort of the preferred approach. And we can't avoid the fact that we need to restore our carbon sinks, our lands, our forests at historic scale. We need to regenerate depleted landscapes, restore our damaged ecosystems, protect areas identified for conservation that are still intact. There's certainly a role for private capital to advance new management strategies for forest and agriculture, to develop themed finance products in the transition discussion. I think that will be critical. But of course, to encourage the transition, consensus is that we need to obviously change institutional perception and behavior around risk, encourage good governance and disclosure of impacts, and develop that sort of financial architecture mentioned above that incentivizes business unusual. So in sum, we must make sure that natural capital is front and center in the transition discussion, and I feel that it's often absent. And in this, there is a role for every one of us, for companies, banks, NGOs, foundations, governments, DFIs, preferably in partnerships, which is what we need to learn. We all need to learn to build. Partnerships are really our key to success in sort of aiding the transition in the land use sector.
Well,
Thanks.
Lisa, thank you. And you surprised me with that 1/3 figure. 1/3 of potential, as it were, the emissions reduction can be addressed by natural solutions, which brings me back to, our definitions and taxonomies, Sean. And there's a question there, I think, flowing from Lisa's comment, and also another one that's come in on the Q&A. Are these natural solutions captured in our taxonomies? And the question that's come in here: are the taxonomies suitably modifiable to reflect local context and conditions such that they can be reliably applied? Sean, do you maybe have some comments on those points?
Of course. Now that does not mean we're going to give you in Europe, give you in Hong Kong a right to emit as much as you want by building gas plants. It's one atmosphere. So we're going to say it's the science we have to look at in critical areas like mitigation, and that is a global solution, because it's the science we have to follow now, no longer the political economy constraints in doing this because of the rapidity of change. But of course, in land use, I'm entirely with Lisa. We need massive forest regrowth in tropical areas. We typically say 50% forest regrowth by 2050 in tropical areas. We need a dramatic change in land use away from carbon release to carbon sequestration. We've had basic starter criteria in the EU taxonomy in these areas. It will need to be elaborated as we go forward, and there will have to be regional variation. There's currently a lot of scope for regional variation around land use based on the kind of emissions tracking you're doing in different parts of the world. So we've got a framework, but I want to say it's only a framework because in the land use area, there's a lot of work to be done around the granular detail. In the work we're doing in the Colombian taxonomy, we've got much more detail on the land use provisions than we have in the European taxonomy. And that gives you a clue to how we go forward. Different regions, as they do work on taxonomy, will need to be synchronized with the Chinese and the European taxonomy because, I mean, you want to raise money in the big markets, right? So you have to be, but also will do more detail and more development on areas of specific importance to their economy to feed in to the national conversation. Think of this as a patchwork quilt of taxonomies. We're working in Chile, South Africa, ASEAN, even Russia at the moment on this issue. This will advance quite quickly next few years. Land use is part of it. Land use has to be part of it. It's such a huge part of our solution. So I fully agree with Lisa. What I don't agree with is a gas company claiming that its emissions are low because it's planting forests in Indonesia. That's what I mean by offsets.
Yeah.
Now, that might work in other schemes, but in the taxonomy, what we care about is the footprint of the gas company.
Yeah.
And a good example is BP, that has now got a fantastic 2050 plan to reduce their emissions. We want to now be able to move to assessing the corporate strategies in the light of the Paris Agreement. Sorry, my apologies, Lisa.
No. In terms
Lisa,
of, my sort of remarks about land use sectors entirely not at all in terms of offsetting, but in terms of sort of mitigation at a local level and dealing with the land use and agriculture problems that we have, that we all see in Asia.
But
Lisa,
Jonathan, if I could just come
Zoe,
in here
please,
very
yes.
briefly on Sean's point about differentiation between the science-based thinking and taxonomy. This is really important because we know that to get to this net zero outcome, the world is going to have to come together because it's a global atmospheric problem. But the starting point of countries is so very different in terms of the embedded infrastructure that's already locking in emissions and what that transition pathway looks like, and the starting point for building new infrastructure and making sure that it is low carbon from the start. And for investors, it's really important to understand how the science-based approach can apply through those different markets. So I really want to congratulate the taxonomy efforts of working between the two nations to bring that to the fore so that the landscape for investors is much easier to align with going forward in terms of Paris outcomes.
Zoe, thank you for that. And I've got another question for you, Zoe, around natural gas, building off Sean's comment. And I'm going to forgive Sean for his opening comment to his last point when he appeared to suggest that ownership of the global carbon budget resided in London, and it was in London's gift to allocate it to Hong Kong. I know you didn't mean that, Sean. It is obviously a global resource, and we have to find a fair transition pathway. And really on that point, and to your point, Zoe, where do you see the role for natural gas? Because we know we've seen, is it a valid transition strategy? Because I think we in Hong Kong, we do. And you know we do because we've been very public with our companies here. And I think in China as well, we see it has roles where you don't have the zero carbon alternative. What's your view on that? So is it just isolated examples, or is there a wider role for methane? And we're seeing it in a lot of sort of transition finance transactions. We're seeing natural gas at the core of them. What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, this is an incredibly tricky one, and it completely plays into the point that if you're starting from a very low carbon power backdrop driven by wind and solar, and you're issuing a green bond to build more wind, the CO2 impact is probably going to be less than if you are issuing a transition bond to move away from coal to gas on a pure transition strategy to get to renewables and to get to that net zero outcome. So I think what we're seeing is more demand for a kind of integrated climate plan, as it were, that shows the stepping stones of additional CO2 improvement to get to that end net zero state. So the role of gas within that is very much location specific, and it's very much part of a positioning in your life cycle of using the gas, i.e. if you've got a gas facility that's already been operating for 10 years, it may not make sense to close it down tomorrow to open something else that has got a 40-year lifespan with a higher carbon lock-in to it. So I guess, the story here is that it's very place-based and it's very project-specific, and it needs the science to help with that discussion around what makes sense within the carbon budget, because we know that we have to move at pace to get emissions down, and we know that we have to do that in a way that also provides livelihoods and prosperity and a backdrop that can allow communities to thrive. So to do that just transition at pace is incredibly complex, but we just need to get on with it. So we need these guidelines from science and the taxonomy working together to say, right, okay, well, this gas shift makes sense in this location for these reasons, and there's an exit strategy. And it's still a tricky conversation to have.
No, Zoe, that makes complete sense. And actually, for those who weren't here early in the afternoon, the Green Finance Association here released a really interesting, and I can say that because I didn't write it, but the association a really interesting paper on a sort of transition finance approach, building in exactly those sort of contextual and localized issues that you touched upon there, and which I think Sean was acknowledging in his sort of, somewhere in his patchwork quilt of definitions.
Jonathan, the problem is the science. The science says we have to reduce global emissions on average by 55% by 2030. That's global average.
Yeah.
To do that, according to a Turk, not a Brit, not a London, Fatih Birol, the chair of the International Energy Agency, there can be no new unabated fossil fuels anywhere in the world to meet the Paris Agreement. So I don't know, I'm just channeling them really. And that's our problem. Now then we have to work backwards and say, well, what the hell do we do then in emerging markets? And now that's what I mean by starting at the science and then look into political economy constraints.
Yeah.
What we've done in the past is said, oh, that's a really difficult. So what we'll do is we'll just build coal for 10 years in India and it'll be fine. It isn't. That's why we're in this mess. And there's a conversation to have. This will play out. But in the EU taxonomy, what we've done is simply channeled the IEA and the IPC 2018 to come up with headlines about what we need to do. And now we have to figure out the implications. Europe is rethinking its energy policy as a result because its past energy policy was not fit for purpose. Every country in the world, Israel is planning to close coal and build gas as its climate policy. Wrong. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. The science has changed. It's a pain in the neck. It's really hard, but we just have to follow the science.
No, and clearly, Sean, and again, I think you must be right that the analysis has to be done, and that is absolutely in a sense the test of robust transition, which actually comes to one of the questions that's come in, and I'll perhaps ask Morgan to touch upon this in sort of two parts. Because we've gotten some of the points that Zoe was talking about carbon capture and storage and hydrogen and some of these natural capital solutions sort of sound like they're quite risky. And we have a sort of prudential framework that sort of is good at identifying risks. And I think, Ashley, in your earlier talk, you talked about the concept of green financing versus financing green. So we need risk appetite to finance green. So, Morgan, I suppose the question to you is, where does that fit, and how does that get accommodated in the sort of thinking of the prudential, the prudential regulator?
Thank you, Jonathan. I actually wanted to step in the discussion because there is someone that we're not mentioning here in this debate is government. At the end of the day, they have to do their job, and when we talk about providing guidance, knowing whether you should invest that particular kind of energy or this one, having clarity, predictability. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the role of governments to do that. And I remember referring to what Lisa said. She was talking about partnership, blended finance, and it's completely the point there. We're not going to make it if we're not working in a coordinated manner. Yeah. And to go back to your question, I mean, the initial observation we had at the NGFS was that there was clearly a mispricing of climate risk. And this mispricing of climate risk was related to a number of things. And in particular, we believe that there were some tools that needed to be developed so that investors in the private sector, people, would be in a better position to measure the exposures and then to shift capital. But this mispricing covers, I would say, the risk and the return side. And clearly, this risk-return analysis doesn't work if you don't have a carbon pricing, and also if you don't give a path to adjust the carbon price progressively so that you can price it and over time develop your strategy. So to go back to what the Prudential Authority can do, well, I mean, at the end of the day, our job is not to facilitate funding for the transition. We have a legal mandate that has to do with risks. Yeah. So what we want to make sure is that banks and insurers are in a position to measure the risk properly, measure the exposures and price the risk. And at the end of the day, what we hope is that by doing so, they will realize that there are some better opportunities for them to invest in. And everything we do is developing the analytical framework, if you like, for them to make that, kind of calculation and say, look, if I really do make my calculation and look at the risk and return side, then it's not worth for me anymore investing in coal or other, carbon-based industry, and instead going to a riskier one. And the point you were mentioning about green and risk, clearly that's the point. If you take back at the risk data right now, all of them are backward-looking. So of course, if you take a look at historical data, then you have some green industry, green investment with a pretty poor track record. For example, solar industry, and when you look back in the past, you have a probability of default that is pretty high. So you need to find a way to have this forward-looking approach, i.e. using scenarios. And in the meantime, you need to have the proper carbon pricing in place so that in the risk-return analysis, clearly investors would rather move to the sustainable investment side than to the brown side. And here our role is helping, providing the tools, providing the analytics for investors and bankers and insurers to actually do the math.
Yeah, Morgan, that's an excellent point, and thank you again for the reminder about the sort of the limitations of scope, which obviously we all have to operate within. I might just come back to you on your question there about that forward-looking analysis that's so key. And if we do that forward analysis and look at that world in the future that we know is going to be very different to the view out of the from the rear view mirror, and that analysis shows better performance in this sector or that sector and poorer performance in another sector, is that a valid basis for then thinking about regulatory capital adjustments?
Well, honestly speaking, within the NGFS, there is no consensus on that point.
Yeah.
For two reasons. First, because we don't have the data the evidence to clearly support that, and also because you have a number of supervisors and central bankers are conservative folks.
Yeah.
They have a legal mandate, so their mandate is about risk, so they would rather take a look at the risk side.
Yeah.
So to answer clearly, I don't see an appetite within the NGFS community to move towards that sort of green supporting factors. Having said that, it's a political decision. And in Europe, for example, there is a SMEs supporting factor in place. So, I mean, if the MEPs decide at some point to introduce, a green supporting factor, then at the end of the day, supervisors and regulators will do the job.
Right. And I guess that's the case with would you say, with the EBA regulation that gives the discount for green infrastructure as part of the rebuild case? Yes.
For example, even though infrastructures are not particularly less risky than other type of investments, but they are considered politically desirable. But you're right, it's more or less the same kind of reasoning.
Morgan, thank you. And it brings me back to sort of listening to Morgan talk there, actually, back to you around, clearly this is encouraging just good investment analysis, looking at the risks over this period. And you made a comment in your earlier point that I was interested in around this, the sort of dilemmas around disclosure. And so we need good disclosure so investors can make good decisions, good allocations. But how do we balance this challenge that there's just so much uncertainty in these very long-dated projections because they're assumptions that are a long way out. How do we balance that with obviously the need to make sure that forward-looking projections are robust and made on a prudential basis?
Yeah, well, it is the single largest challenge, alongside something which has just been mentioned actually, which is carbon pricing as being a sort of critical element to in our world, how disclosure is formulated to be in that well-worn phrase, decision useful. But yeah, I mean the forward-looking aspect, scenario analysis, and similar, and now I think the Tcfd has only very recently produced a report on other metrics which are to do with forward-looking statements, including value at risk, and that's been, or climate value at risk, which has been used by some organisations. I think AXA was one who's used that. The essential problem, as I mentioned earlier, is that those forward-looking statements don't fit well within a conventional regulatory scheme of the sort that we regulate. That's just the reality. However, I think that the other angle to this, which is different standards, so that basically corporates can pick and choose, is in the process of potentially being solved. If you solve that, then you get to a world where more corporates are actually using the same standards. And as I said earlier, if we reverse that into the IFRS world, you get even further into that because you may have an ability to effectively audit that, but the content of this and the audit standards that would apply would have to be very carefully constructed.
Yes.
But I think we have to do that because otherwise we're kind of stuck in this position whereby regulators are being asked to ensure that corporates disclose sufficiently meaningful, decision useful, forward-looking statements, but really without the consensus around the metrics, the methodologies, etc., that need to inform all of that.
Yes.
And that's where we are right now. But I think actually with an agreement effectively amongst at least 5 standard setters global to converge, and the potential of that convergence being reversed into a financial statement governance structure which currently exists, that might be the best way forward around that. But I also, there are limitations as to what regulators are able to do, and it's been pointed out. We are there effectively to give the investor community the best information available on risk and reward.
Yes.
And ultimately, it is up to governments, alone and in partnership, to put in place the mandatory policies around transition that then are factored into the disclosures.
Yes.
That's absolutely essential. Just one point. I just want to pick up on something that Sean mentioned, and he's absolutely right. And this is about Hong Kong's role in relation to China. Now, when was it? Last May, I think it was. We convened a meeting in Hong Kong, which Dr. Marjon attended. So did ESMA, the European Securities Regulator. So did the European Commission, and actually Tcfd did as well in the form of Mary Shapiro came to that, and that's where we had an initial discussion around or the proposal was put at that meeting around a common taxonomy as between mainland China, or China as a whole, and Europe. And it was really good to see that was picked up and pursued. Now, just coming to the US election, I haven't managed to look at my iPhone while I've been sitting here because it's a bit rude to do so when you're on a panel. But if you assume that the administration in the US might change, the theory that we had around Europe and China was if you put the two together and you get a sufficiently harmonized or common taxonomy, you're covering 40% of the world's GDP. Yeah. If you add the US, you're covering a very, very large additional slice. Now, the US and taxonomy don't really go together at the moment.
Yeah.
But if you're able to do that, it would be very, very, very powerful. Second point that Sean made was, what's Hong Kong's role? Look, Hong Kong's own impact on the atmosphere is absolutely minuscule. It's even smaller than Europe's. However, we all know that China's impact is very, very significant. Hong Kong's role in relation to China in finance is, there are multiple strands, but a very, very large one is around the way in which we can intermediate global capital to domestic markets in the mainland. And I can certainly see in the context of carbon trading, carbon exchanges, etc., that Hong Kong's role could well be more around that than anything else. Final point in relation to Hong Kong, we need to set a net zero goal in Hong Kong, which we haven't done.
Ashley, based on Sean's information and knowledge about what's happened in Pennsylvania and Arizona, add that to your analysis upon the implications of that, plus the role and opportunity for Hong Kong to contribute, I think makes a great place to sum up and close this panel. So it really just remains for me to thank all of the panelists for their amazing contributions to this discussion. Thank you all for joining in your mornings in Europe, and Ashley, for you to coming here to join us at HSBC Studios. Thank you all very much. I hope that the participants have enjoyed that as much as I did. I'm scribbling notes. There were many, many questions. Thank you for those questions. Thank you for participating. We'll close the panel here with just a wish that everybody stays safe and healthy. Thank you.